So what does make a good finale? Different people are gonna have different opinions on that, and if I were to make a list of my own favorites, you probably wouldn't get just one consistent thing, though some do stick with me more than others. In fact, we might even want to change the theme from best to most memorable, so why not go ahead and put together a list with that as the focus? Probably should go without saying, but there will be spoilers for each of these, though I'll try to have enough build up, and you can also check the timestamps for specifics if you're still worried. So with that, I'm Wes the Explosion, and here's the half dozen games whose endings left the biggest impression on me. You ever experience a story where you know the ending, but you hope you're wrong? You know, episode 1 through 3 Anakin Skywalker? Yeah, that's King of Cards for me. It's another prequel where the main character is a bad guy in what comes after, so you know where he's gonna wind up. Before this, I was pretty meh on King Knight. He's an early boss that isn't too hard to take out, he's kind of a jerk, and his level is a castle in a game that already uses a medieval setting. So who cares? But playing through his campaign, I found out that he comes from squalor and all his boasting and ambitions are to escape his less than mediocre life, where all he really has is his mom and his rats. He sees the Joustus card tournament as his ticket to the top and even finds a loophole so that he doesn't need to actually play the game if the player doesn't want to. And as you advance through the story, he starts assembling a crew of loyal followers, all of which have their own reasons for joining him, but each seeing the potential in him. One of the kings he usurps even treating him as the son he never had, and King Knight, in turn, gets the respect and acceptance he always wanted. The situation is pretty beneficial all around and uplifting, but because this is a prequel, you know it's not going to last. Though there was at least a part of me that hoped that I was wrong. Maybe this is an alternate timeline. Maybe he gets mind controlled. Maybe he's playing the long game and waiting for his chance to take down the Enchantress himself. But then stupid Shovel Knight comes and ruins everything. But no, you get to the end, King Knight gets a choice, and he makes the wrong one you always knew, deep down, he would. Not only that, but his first decree after making his deal with the devil is to destroy all Joustus cards, in turn burning his past, and getting rid of something that not only never did him any good, but also brought joy to so many others, in an act that's the height of pettiness. And this gets me every time. Its place on the timeline was used effectively to drive a wedge between my expectations and what I actually wanted to have happen. I don't know if I'd say that this conclusion leaves me wanting the best for King Knight, so much as I want to see King Knight become his best self, though at least for now, that remains a dream. A Hat in Time does something a little unique before you even go up against the final boss, allowing you to run away like a weenie instead of fight. If you do the second, you change your mind and pop right back, but it's funny because that is literally always a choice. You can just quit a game at any time, leaving things in a weird sort of limbo where, technically, if you don't go back, the bad guys kinda win, right? It's just not something that's typically drawn attention to. But that's just a fun little aside. The final battle is nuts. It's starting out as just a simple one-on-one, where you fight a boss that's stronger than you, but with patterns that you can exploit, before the bulk of the cast from the rest of the game march in, tell your foe Mustache Girl off, and in a fit, she starts warping reality and throwing out bigger attacks. And things just continue to escalate from there. First, it's just wilder strikes, but when you're able to effectively counter that, she starts teleporting before you can get close enough to hit her, so some of your cheerleaders give you a ranged attack. Then she produces a shield that you can't break through, so another two start tossing you things that can. Then Mustache Girl starts attacking the audience, and they in turn realize that they can effectively turn you invincible if they sacrifice themselves, saying that Hat Kid can just reset things with her timepieces if she wins. It's also worth mentioning that your allies in this fight are all largely enemies who ostensibly hate you, yet they still consider Hat Kid better than Mustache Girl, and trust you to do the right thing if you win. While the goofy dialogue and scenarios already endeared the cast to me, even the baddies, this really brought things home for me. And after another little chaotic bit of battle that you can go at with reckless abandon, bam, the game is cleared. And once you've conquered your enemy, you're given another choice. Give Mustache Girl a small portion of the power they stole from you to help them build the future that they wanted in a more reasonable manner, despite it possibly hampering your own journey, or deny them, without them ever knowing that you considered helping. So far, there's no sequel, so no right or canonical choice. It's a more personal one, based on your own experiences in both the game and in life, which I kinda think makes it more special. I've seen both, though I usually go for helping. But the thing that really gets me is what happens after that. Hat Kid takes to the controls of your ship, and while preparing to fly away, I found myself kinda wishing that the game wasn't over, that there were still more levels and challenges to tackle, and the ship stalls. Hat Kid goes over to the window, and as if reading my thoughts, some of the characters that helped you in your final fight, specifically your enemies, weigh the ship down and ask Hat Kid to stay, using more of the same crap they put you through before as a pretense for keeping her around. Hat Kid sweeps them off before firing up the engines again, though she does tear up before hitting the accelerator and leaving, making me realize that while this was the goal, I wasn't the only one who wished we could have played around just a little bit more. The ending for Majora's Mask can vary from player to player. Well, the broad strokes are the same. You beat Majora, retrieve the mask, dissolve the moon, reconcile some friendships, and then finally set back off on the mission that Link was on before you were so rudely interrupted. But the scenes that play as the credits roll by can either be jam-packed, pretty sparse, or somewhere in the middle, depending on how thoroughly you explored Termina. Because Majora isn't the only mask in the game, while you get 3 transformation masks, deeply tied into the main quest, you can also find 20 others that are varying degrees of helpful and one note, but ultimately each something more mundane than turning into a little wooden boy or a giant rock man. And the way you get almost all of these little trinkets is by doing side quests, or to put it another way, helping people. Because even though Majora's Mask is one of the creepiest, darkest, and most hopeless feeling games of its time, one of the main themes is kindness. The game has you repeating the same 3 days over and over again, and most NPCs have a schedule. And while most casts would just have a bunch of one-note randos repeating the same line or two just to fill out the world, between having routines, most of these have their own problems to solve, and sometimes unique reactions, based on what mask you talk to them with. It made Termina feel more alive, and if you took enough of an interest to solve their troubles, you'd be rewarded with a mask or a heart piece, the latter commonly requiring the former. Then, at the end of the game, you'd be greeted with credits where, if you completed a quest for a character, you'd see how everything turned out for them, and if you didn't, you'd just see the mask associated with their story scroll across the screen. And as you may have noticed, I don't have any of that, because I always make sure to help absolutely everyone. One of the other things about the game is that when you restart your 72 hours, it resets everyone else's cycle as well. Some problems require you to forsake one character to save another, so realistically, only those you help during your final cycle should be the ones that stay happy. But no matter what your last 3 days were like, anyone you help during the entire game will show up in good shape. Now, maybe this is more a cinematic thing. One character in the sequence shows up who should be dead, but he also does so in the form that you take when donning his mask, and you've already left. But it wouldn't be much of a concert without the whole band, so maybe all of this is just creative liberty. But I'd like to think that everything worked out. As the happy mask salesman turns to leave, he mentions all the people you've managed to help have left the mask that you've collected full of happiness, so maybe some of that leaked out and made the people who gave them to you get their good ending, regardless of circumstances, kinda like a wish. Or maybe that's just wishful thinking. But either way, seeing all the characters I'd gotten to know throughout the experience find happiness makes me feel warm and ends the game on a good note. Though there is one last scene right near the end that has some somber implications, reminding you that you can't always save everyone. But if you do go for that 100%, that does mean that you've saved most, and sometimes that's gotta be enough. Extra point in Majora's Mask favor if you did manage to get all the masks, trade them into the Moon Children, and get the Fierce Deity mask to completely obliterate the final boss. Always love it when you're rewarded with something game-breaking after you put in the work. There's a lot of points I could make about Sonic Adventure 2's ending. First is the whole convergent storyline thing. You have the hero and dark routes, and once you complete that, the final story gets sprung on you, and all the characters that have been at odds are suddenly working together to avoid a grim fate. Well, except for Grumpy Pants over here, though he too comes around and fights the Bio Lizard, before Sonic and Shadow team up to go super for one final battle with the Beast, in space, complete with Butt Rock. Of course, that became pretty standard for a while, but there's two things that make it particularly special here. The first is that Sega and Nintendo had been at odds for so long, and despite liking Sonic, I grew up in a Nintendo household, so not only was it cool that the two companies were finally playing nice, but that made it also the first time I experienced most of this. Might be worth mentioning that Adventure 2 was ported to the GameCube before its predecessor, oddly enough, which probably was the better move in the long run. So while I was kind of expecting some sort of final cutscene to tie the two storylines together and make the hero version the more canonical one, Final Story was a surprise. Plus, it was the first time I ever saw Eggman working with Sonic. It flipped a lot of the narrative on its head, making me rethink and theorize on what some of the implications were, beyond the obvious stuff. And while I had, oddly enough, beaten a CD-ROM port of Sonic 3 and Knuckles, with Knuckles, no way did Kid Me have the skills to beat Blue Spear or Red Spear, so this was the first time I got a super form. 2 at that. But the big thing, the one that really sold it for me, was that damn song. Sitting on the main menu gave you the basic tune of Live and Learn, and you just kind of assumed that it was a short little thing just for that. Then, all of a sudden, you get this finale where Crush 40 is belting the lyrics at you as you throw yourself at a giant lizard, trying to huck a space station at Earth, and you realized it was a full song. It was awesome, it was amazing, I will never get over it. It really shows just how powerful music can be when used right, or just when it's a bop, and here it has both. And for bonus points, at the end of the fight, Shadow totally dies. But he was so cool that Sega decided that was stupid and brought him back, putting him in a unique club with these guys. Splatoon 2's Octo expansion DLC is another special one. When you finally reach the surface, you're greeted by Pearl and Marina, members of the band Off the Hook, and your benefactors, them guiding you through the deep sea metro and even helping you cheat if you happen to hit a wall. Assuming you aren't too stubborn. And while it's exciting to finally meet them in person, this is quickly overshadowed by a Greek Statue of Liberty rising from the water, controlled by a human-obsessed rogue AI who wants to use its cannon to destroy the city and reset the world. To topple this threat, you need to climb and grind around this behemoth to do what you always do, cover it in ink. The task is a bit daunting for one Octoling though, so you do it with support from Pearl and Marina, which makes it feel like you're finally a team, rather than their charity case, since they're also invested in society not getting wiped out, and everyone has a part to play. Marina will drop hyperbombs strategically around the statue every 30 seconds that you need to manually detonate to completely cover it. It starts out slow, you being able to tackle things with a simple trot, and it's easy to outpace the drops early on, but things ramp up, and by the end, you're zipping around on ink rails, trying to nail the last few bombs before the 3-minute time limit runs out. If you fail, rather than just getting splatted and then respawning at the checkpoint, you get an actual scene of the city getting wiped out, which I kept skipping when revisiting this for footage like a pathetic child, though this extra scene, along with the time limit, really ramps up the pressure and keeps the experience tight. Succeed, and wait out the last few seconds to see Pearl deliver the coup de grace with a weapon that was actually banned from Splatoon 2. Canonically, not just by a bunch of number-crunching nerds. The fight is fun, it's satisfying, it really sells the characters and their dynamic, but what really lodges it in my brain is the music. While I feel lame bringing this up twice in a row, I think Splatoon might have actually one-up Sonic on this, which seems impossible. Once again, the music starts up at the beginning of the sequence, and while it's something you haven't heard before, it's somehow familiar. You get hints of Fly Octo Fly in the campaign, most notably the jingle that plays when you collect one of the Thangs, which is the primary goal in the story, so it's another instance of hearing a sample of music, only to find out it's actually a full-blown song in the grand finale. What puts it over Live and Learn for me though is that when you get to the final phase of the boss fight, the last minute, because with a time limit, the music can last exactly as long as it needs to, it seamlessly transitions into Ebb and Flow, one of Off the Hook's most notable songs that plays during Splatfest. So not only is it a track that you're familiar with but don't realize is part of a bigger song, it's also a song that you already know that you get a new remix of. So while Live and Learn blew my mind, Fly Octo Fly did it twice, on top of being paired with an amazing sequence. And then, upon victory, you get the credits, along with another new song, Into the Light. And for a few honorable mentions, there's Pokemon Scarlet Violet, which had me leaping at my PC to mute game audio, so that Ed Sheeran wouldn't copyright strike me. We'll never stop talking about that, and it was definitely a good use of Game Freak's money. I'm also still thinking about Mega Man X8's ending because, over 20 years later, it's still never been resolved. Virtual Unlimited projects had me feeling like I was going mad when, after 2 back-to-back playthroughs, I found myself forgetting some of the scenes and dialogue popping up before I realized that you got more lore on higher difficulties. Well, either that or they snuck in a patch after my first clear but before I finished my second. This definitely isn't here as another ploy to recommend the game, on Steam now. And getting more in depth with these next two, so refresh the spoiler warning. As much as I loved Battle Network 6, there was something kinda melancholy when they hit you with the Lan grew up, got married, and had a kid ending. While of course that's the kind of conclusion you'd want, battling alongside that kid for 6+ games only to be told goodbye was pretty sad. And that they killed all 2 of my favorite characters, again, when I thought that they might finally get a happy ending in this timeline, didn't help either. And finally, there's Legends Arceus, which doesn't make the cut just because there might be some recency bias. While the Pokédex is always a thing, there was a much bigger focus on it in this game. So you do that, and when you finish, you report back to Professor Lavington. This is the guy who takes you in and vouches for you when everyone else treats you with suspicion, and when you're exiled from Jubilife Village, the people there acting almost like they might be considering executing you instead, he's still on your side. So when you go to report that you completed the Pokédex, the only thing he's really asked of you this entire time, he thanked you. And as simple as that was, I almost cried. He was the only person who had your back the entire game, so finally being able to do something for him, and having him express his appreciation, despite feeling like I was still very much indebted, really got to me. There's a little get-together afterwards where you're rewarded with a shiny charm, and it doesn't really have the same amount of spectacle that the boss fight just before did, but even with that lack of fanfare, this conversation was still the most special to me. You didn't think I'd regulate Mega Man to just 2 honorable mentions, one of which was pretty flippant, did you? No, my top pick is not just a game's conclusion, it's a full series finale, 0-4. Now, be honest. Most villains in games are just obstacles. Sure, if a bad guy's despicable enough, it'll get a bit personal and you'll want to take him down, but for the most part, you kill Sigma, take down Giovanni, and retrieve your bananas from K. Rool because they're there. And like I said, there are those that'll tick me off, but I tend to forget about them when I beat the game. There have been only 2 villains that made me clamor for their heads and still live rent-free in my mind. And one of them isn't a final boss, so I'll let you guess on that. The other is Dr. Vile. While he doesn't show up until 3 other than a quick faceless post-credits scene in the entry before, pretty much everything that happens in the series is his fault. And while things have slowed down during his exile, stuff goes from pretty darn bad to abysmally worse upon his return, him quickly taking control of everything and even manipulating events so that you wind up helping him achieve this. He treats Reploids like tools and people like possessions, and is cartoonishly evil. I could talk about Vile for a while, and maybe someday I will, but the crux of the conversation would be this. I hate this guy, hate him perhaps more than any character in media. I want him dead, and will do anything to make that happen. Then I got a final boss with the opportunity to prove it. Will I kill Vile, even if it means dying in the process? Though it's Zero's decision to make, and he takes it. It adds a lot of tension to the fight since Zero's sacrificing himself, but that all amounts to nothing if you don't just win, but do it under a pretty dicey time limit, especially since Vile spends a good bit of time blocking, and how frequently he throws out something you can counter can be the difference between victory and defeat. While I don't think it's ever impossible, there can be a pretty big difference in how many times you can whiff. And if you do win, that's it, the series is done. While I mentioned a pretty definitive conclusion earlier in the honorable mentions, there's still space there to fit in something new if they really wanted to, but killing off your main character is as final as you can get. While there is precedent for Zero coming back, I think this is the one Mega Man series that, if Capcom made another game for, I'd kick them so hard in the junk that they wouldn't be able to have any new sequels, they'd need to adopt them from other studios. But back to 0-4, it feels like one of the most perfect endings to a series. Killing Vile is very satisfying, and I also got the impression that Zero was kinda looking for a place to die given some of the missions he took on, so it's a good exit for them both. There's also a lot of scars from the Maverick and Elf Wars, and while Zero is a hero, he's also a reminder of those times, and with Vile being one of the main instigators of the second, their disappearance lets the world finally move on. Plus, while Ciel is brilliant and capable, it also seemed like she was holding herself back due to her over-reliance and infatuation with Zero. So with him out of the picture, she'll likely be able to stand on her own and be the person she was meant to be. Most importantly of all, the walls finally start coming down between Reploids and humans, and the two peoples start working together. And this isn't just wishful thinking. In ZX, the two are nigh indistinguishable and the world has actually enjoyed a long period of peace. So while Zero might sacrifice himself, I think it's hard to argue that it wasn't worth it, and the man is finally allowed to rest. At least for a while. I made this video largely for the last two games, but as I started trying to puff up the list, I came up with more than I was expecting, each of which filled me with various types of feelings. I even wound up pushing 2 into the honorable mentions. That does bring up the point that not everything that sticks with you is positive though. I did mention 2 with a bit of a negative spin to them briefly, but I could have also brought up something that was a relief to be done with, a final boss that drags down the whole experience, or a title that craps the bed for a whole series that was previously a favorite. Don't pay attention to whatever I just flashed on the screen, I'm sure it's unrelated. I meant for this to be more of a celebration of finales that really moved me, so I decided to stay on the positive side of things. And while I said my reasons vary, most of my picks did include at least a little bit of a narrative element. While gameplay is king, writing is what tends to keep me thinking. Anyway, those are just mine, so do I actually want to ask this? I had spoiler warnings on mine, but I could be walking into forbidden knowledge if I asked for audience participation. What if this blows the lid off of backlog title number 47? Okay, so for this one, you can comment on my picks or list your own, but don't get too mad at me if I don't read all of them or reply back to all the early ones. I need some grace here. My weaseling aside, that'll do it for this week, so thanks as always for watching. Maybe consider subscribing if you're into retro games, especially Mega Man. Fly, Octo, fly, and falling down play on loop in my head. Also live and learn.